well. But in the studio, man who's been one of our decision makers for some time, but he's now the former Taxi Services Commissioner as of yesterday when he finished up. Graham Samuel, good morning.
Morning, Neil.
What's it feel like?
Oh, a bit of a relief, I have to say. It's been a tough 3 years, with dealing with a whole lot of issues, not the least of which was a taxi industry inquiry report, which frankly was, I thought out of date the date it was issued. I've described it privately as a bit of a dud. And it really was, because what it did was it recommended a whole series of sort of modified regulations to regulate the industry. The knowledge test, too bad the knowledge test them open to my experience on Friday, but the knowledge test zones so that drivers couldn't go across different territorial areas to compete with each other. Issues relating to colours of taxis, advertising, things like that. Regulated taxi fares, which are sort of calculated by some economists at the Essential Services Commission. And then the worst of all of that report was that they locked in a licence fee of $40,000 for hire cars, and then locked in an annual licence fee for taxis of $20,000 plus. Well, I mean, was it any wonder that Uber came along, and Uber actually was around at the time, but was totally ignored by the report. The report has no mention of Uber or any like service in it at all. And so what happens is Uber comes in, rubs its hand with glee, says, well, this is great. This report is recommending that the taxi industry be regulated out of existence. We're going to ignore all those regulations and focus on the only regulation that really, really matters, and that is, what does the consumer want? Consumer regulation, consumer empowerment, and leaving aside some issues that relate to safety, which are essential regulations.
So this report, this is the Fels report, known as the Fels report. You're saying it was a dud.
I think it was, Neil, because if the Fels report had been focused on what really mattered, which is competition, it was very surprising that here was two competition regulators, Fels and Cousins from the ACCC, who didn't focus on competition and how it could be increased. So you've got Uber and Lyft and other like businesses setting themselves up overseas. They're already in existence in San Francisco. They're starting in Europe. And they'd entered Australia in November 2012, a month before the report was issued. And what it should have signalled to the inquiry was, how do we deal with new competition? How do we open this industry competition? There's nothing better for the consumer than competition, because competition's a great regulator. It really does. When the consumer is empowered, then competition takes over, and competition is a great regulator. So why this report, 139 recommendations with a whole series of things about, well, modify this regulation, modify that one. But the worst thing of all was that they put the taxi industry at a major disadvantage. They said to the taxi industry, before you can ride a taxi each year, you've got to pay $20,000 licence fee. Uber said, we're not doing that.
So you're saying that that report has in fact been part of the reason we have the crisis with Uber?
Well, there's no question in my mind that what happened was, first the Nathaniel government, then the Andrews government have been lumbered with, straitjacketed with that report. Legislation was passed locking in licence fees. And you look at a taxi operator. A taxi operator, before he starts the year, knows he has to pay out a licence fee of, now it's $18,000 to $20,000. The government fee is around $23,000, $24,000. So his business is already starting in deficit by that amount of money. The Uber driver doesn't have that fee, has none of that at all. So he's already $20,000 better off before he starts the year. Is it any wonder that the Uber driver and Uber can discount their fares substantially below that of a taxi driver? Then the Essential Services Commission gets into the act, as it must under the law, and it says, well, now let's calculate what sort of fares we need to enable a taxi to be profitable, and it puts them up at sky-high levels. And look, I had an experience the other day, when I was able to compare prices of Uber versus a taxi. I could tell you the difference was monumental, like 30 and 40% different.
Well, can the taxi industry survive this?
I think it can, and the exit recommendations that we've made, the Taxi Commission has made to the Minister, is to say, have another look at this whole industry, disregard the original report, because as I say, it was out of date the day it was issued, and have a look at the industry in the context of the competition that now is there from Uber and Lyft and the like. Look at the industry with a clear focus on empowering the consumer. Let the consumer make the choice as to what sort of a ride they want. But importantly, this is the important thing, protect the consumer in safety terms, and that means police checks and the like, and accreditation of drivers. But having done that, let the consumer really impose his or her power on the industry and across the board with Uber and the like.
But you need a whole new, yet another review of the taxi industry.
Well, you do, although, because one of the things you might do is just go through the Act and start deleting a whole lot of regulations. You know, that's really the essence of it. See, we've got this knowledge test. Now, the knowledge test is fascinating. I took a taxi from the airport the other day and said to the driver, lovely young man, clean taxi and all, said, take me to Malvern. He said, can you guide me? This is my first day.
Yeah.
And I had to guide him over the Balti Bridge, which lane to take and the like. I'm thinking, what's the value of this knowledge test that we administer? You know,
he's passed the knowledge test.
He's passed the knowledge test, clearly. But it's just such a pity that we do that. Whereas what Uber says, see, Uber doesn't put them through knowledge tests and all. What it says is, rate your driver. Right? And I had one in Sydney the other day, wasn't very satisfactory. I rated him 3. Uber came back to me and said, look, we're really sorry, tell us what happened. And I explained what happened. And they said, that driver will have a mark against his name, and if this continues to repeat itself, then he'll be taken off our list. That's the way it should be. That's the consumer being empowered.
So do you see a system where they both operate? Do you see a dual system, Uber and a taxi industry?
Absolutely, yes. But I think what we've got to do is we've got to put the taxi industry on a level playing field. We've got to remove the licence fees so that they're on the same level playing field as Uber. The taxi industry, I think, will rather more become rank and hail, which is its primary focus, and that's where the bulk of its work comes at the present time. But you know, let me give an example. If you're going to pre-book a taxi, why have you got to have the fare regulated? Why doesn't the taxi simply say to you, our estimate of the fare is as follows to take you from A to B, you know, and that's it, and that's the way it works.
If you have a rank and hail cab service, you'll have fewer cabs, won't you? Do we need fewer cabs?
Well, look, we might or might not, but look, we find there's certain times of the day or night where there's too few cabs, and I'm thinking about sort of late at night, you know, sort of 10 p.m. through to 5 a.m. in the morning. But again, see, what we do there is we regulate the fares that the taxi drivers can charge. And that's set by the Essential Services Commission, and in all their wisdom, they set a certain premium on it. What happens is that in certain areas, and we know, for example, up at Crown, there's too few taxis. So what the young people do as they come out from the gambling halls is that they touch their Uber app, they get an Uber car. It might cost them more, but at least they can get home. And so that's how it works.
Have you made these recommendations to government?
Oh, look, I think we've been talking to government for some time, and I won't go into detail about my communications with the minister, other than to say that the minister's well aware, I think, that we need to really review the whole regulatory scene. We've imposed a massive dead weight, a lead weight around the neck of the taxi industry in licence fees and in regulations that are not appropriate, not necessary. The best regulation of all, aside from issues of safety, the best regulation of all is to empower the consumer to make a choice.
Pretty frustrating, though, if we've got to have yet another review. I mean, the industry, as you know, is struggling. Drivers are struggling to make a quid. There's the Uber position's been undecided for more than a year, and yet we need yet another review.
Well, I don't think we need a review.
Year.
I don't think we need a review, Neil. Look, I think it'll be pretty clear now the sort of things that could really start the thing, start it rolling. For example, if we can give a level playing field for taxis and Uber. Uber is out there operating.
So what do we do? You sit down and look at the legislation, and well, that's a ministerial thing, isn't it?
Yeah, well, and it is, and with appropriate advice. I mean, the first thing I would do is to delete the licence fees. You can't have Uber out there providing a business for its drivers without paying a licence fee at all, and then say to a taxi, well, before you start the year, you're $20,000 worse off.
So you get away with the licence fees. You would regulate Uber to the point of view of safety and checks on drivers and vehicles and the rest, as the taxis have now. There's 2 key steps. Anything else?
Yeah, look, frankly, I don't think we need the knowledge test. The knowledge test is one of those checker box type tests that we put drivers through. My experience the other day shows that with all that doesn't help that much. My own view is that what you do is you say to those that engage the drivers and the operators, the various networks, Well, now look, you make sure your drivers are good. You know, you impose your own training on them and you make sure that they're good. And if they're no good, that'll soon show up because people will start to say, we're not going to take this taxi or a taxi from that firm.
There was that Essential Service Commission report earlier this year, a significant and accelerating decline in taxi trips, 9% down between April and June compared to the year before. Does that continue unless we do something? I mean, if we don't do something, does the industry go out backwards?
Well, it does, and I think the biggest issue is going to be both the quality of the drivers and your ability or otherwise to rate them, but more importantly, be the cost. You know, if you talk about an airport trip, say from the suburbs, there can be a difference in cost there of some 20-odd%. Well, you know, in favour of Uber, well, people are going to ask themselves, why would I pay the extra? Because the fare is regulated. Now, yeah, we can have things like fixed fares. If we're going to pre-book a taxi, I'd really like to be able to say to the taxi company, I'll pay you X dollars. You know, and they'll say, yeah, look, the fixed fare is this. It's been in there in New York for more years than you and I can remember.
Well, that's true. Some states have been offering compensation to drivers or licence holders once Uber's allowed into the marketplace. Will we have to do that?
That's both an economic and a political question, and the economics don't necessarily marry up with the politics, Neil. So I'll give you the economic answer, which is that I think that compensation is not necessarily appropriate. And there's a very good reason, and if we had the time, I could explain it. But the real problem that's occurred with licence plates in this state is that we allowed them back in 1995 to be separated from the taxi. So the licence plate owner, there's 30% of them that are actually a part of the taxi business itself, but about the rest, they're separated from the taxi business itself. Now, what that means is that the taxi business, the operator of the taxi business, is paying $20,000 a year licence fee to the licence plate owner. He's worse off by $20,000 a year. The licence plate owner is better off by $20,000 a year. Now, if you put them together, and the market can work that through, but if you put them together, suddenly the taxi business is $20,000 better off and is put back onto a level playing field with Uber. And that's the way it ought to be. So I'm not sure that there's a role for compensation, but there will be a political question to be dealt with there, and that's up to government. I might know, for example, that in New South Wales, the compensation is pretty small. I think it's about $20,000 per licence with a maximum of 2 licences per holder. So, you know, it's not an awful lot compared to, say, the hundreds of thousands that were paid by licence plate holders many years ago.
I just want to make clear what your formula is here. It's to remove the licence fees on cabs, let the market effectively decide pricing, and to regulate areas of safety on vehicles and drivers in Uber. Is that correct?
Yes, except for one thing. With rank and hail, you've got to have some capping on fares. There's a reason for that. Can you imagine going to a rank or hailing a taxi in the street, in the city, and you hail it and you say, look, I want to go, say, to wherever it might be, to Malvern. And he says, yeah, look, the fare I'll charge you is $80. That's too high. Go away and I'll wait for the next one. And you can, there are what the economists call transaction costs in doing that. So you've probably got to put caps on rank and hail. But for pre-bookings, you know, why should it be any different to Uber?
And if you follow your formula here, who sets the number of cabs on the road? Is that the market?
The market does.
So you issue some form of licence to a cab, but you don't charge for it.
Yeah, and the only condition on a licence is that you've satisfied medical checks and police checks, and then when you are accredited, as ought to be with Uber and anyone else that sets up a similar service, the moment the drivers are accredited, they can go into what I've always favoured, which is this weekly cross-data check with Victoria Police to make sure that there's nothing lurking beneath the surface that we're not aware of that means that driver ought to be taken off the road.
Well, look, it makes a lot of sense. We're going to have to sort it out, aren't we? Because it's not going away.
Well, yeah, and I think what's happening is that the combination of the unfortunate taxi inquiry report that locked in a whole lot of really bad regulations, combined with the fact that government now has to try and sort out this mess that's been created by that. And look, I have to say to you, Neil, I do feel for successive Nepthon and Andrews governments with this. They were lumbered with a report that was totally inadequate, that ignored the really fundamental principle, the big C word, competition.
Yeah, but they embraced it. They didn't have to.
Well, yeah, but unfortunately they didn't have the... they paid millions of dollars for a report from so-called experts, and they thought, well, that was going to give it to them. That was going to give them the wisdom that they needed. Unfortunately, it didn't. It led them astray.
Did you enjoy being Taxi Services Commissioner?
There was a time when we were starting to bring about some changes that it was good, but there were some other tough times. I mean, as is probably sort of well known, there was a period of time when I had security guards on my front, outside the front of my house, because some silly people had put the private address onto Facebook and had urged drivers to go and do some silly things at the house. So it had to be security guards. Now that's unpleasant for the family and all, but I've done some other tough jobs in my life. So
do you feel you achieved anything as taxi services?
I'm not sure at the moment. I have to say to you, I think Uber's achieved a lot more than what we've achieved with many of the reforms. I think the reforms give you a sense that you've achieved something, Neil. But what you've done is you've modified regulations. You've locked in new regulations. You've regulated this industry to near death. And I think that the sooner we actually look at it and say, no, the best regulation, other than for safety, the best regulation of all is the consumer. Empower the consumer to make a choice. Tell those that are supplying the service, whether it's Uber or GoCatch or IngoGo or Silvertop, 13Cab, doesn't matter. Empower the consumer to say to them, unless you provide us with the service we want at the price we want to pay, we won't use you.
Do you use Uber or taxis?
Oh, I use Uber and taxis.
That's probably the future. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Neil.
Graham Samuel, until yesterday, the Taxi Services Commissioner. Your views, give me a call.